The letter arrived on a Tuesday, crumpled at the edges and smelling faintly of dried lavender, and when Elias Calloway read it for the third time standing at his kitchen table, his hands would not stop shaking. It was the year 1882, deep in the heart of the New Mexico territory, where the sun scorched the earth to a pale amber crust, and the wind came roaring off the Sangre de Cristo Mountains like something alive and angry. The town of Red Rock Crossing sat at the junction of two cattle trails, a rough-and-tumble settlement of maybe 300 souls, with a saloon, a general store, a livery stable, a sheriff's office that had seen better days, and a small whitewashed church that the Reverend Gideon Marsh kept scrubbed clean every single Saturday whether the Lord seemed to notice or not. Elias Calloway was 31 years old, broad across the shoulders, with calloused hands and sun-darkened skin, and eyes the color of strong black coffee. He ran the Broken Spur Ranch, which had once belonged to his father and his father's father before that, a working cattle operation of about 2,000 acres that sat 3 miles east of town on a flat stretch of grassland backed by a low ridge of red sandstone. He was not a man given to sentiment. He was not a man given to many words at all. The other ranchers in the valley would tell you that Elias Calloway could go 3 days without speaking a complete sentence and seem perfectly content about it, that he knew cattle the way other men knew their own faces in a mirror, that he could read a storm coming in from the west before the clouds even gathered. What they could not tell you, because Elias never spoke of it, was that the ranch house he came home to every night was very quiet. His mother had died of fever 8 years ago. His father had followed her 2 years after that, taken by a bad fall from a horse on an icy January morning. His one younger brother, Tom, had ridden south toward Texas in 1879 with a group of other young men full of ideas, and had never come back, though Elias received occasional letters that made him believe Tom was alive and more or less all right somewhere near San Antonio. The foreman, a grizzled old Mexican-American man named Diego Reyes who had worked the land since Elias's father's time, lived in a small bunkhouse near the barn with 2 younger ranch hands, Willie Hatch and Coy Beaumont. They were good men. They took care of the cattle and the fences and the wells. But at the end of the day they went to their own quarters, and Elias went into the big empty house and listened to the wind push itself against the walls. It was Diego who had finally said something about it, one evening in late February while they were mending a stretch of fence line near the northern pasture. "You need a wife," Diego said simply, the way he might announce that a particular cow needed worming or that a fence post needed replacing. Elias did not answer for a long moment. "I know what I need," he said finally. "Then do something about it," Diego said, and drove another staple into the post with practiced efficiency. The conversation ended there, as most conversations with Elias tended to. But the idea, once planted, took root in the dry soil of his thinking, the way certain desert plants take root in rock, slowly, stubbornly, with deep and persistent tenacity. He was not the sort of man who could walk into a saloon and charm a woman off her feet. He had tried courting once, 3 years ago, a schoolteacher named Helen Prout, who had come to Red Rock Crossing full of hopes about the frontier, and had lasted precisely 1 winter before returning to St. Louis, and sending back his single gift of a silver hair comb with a polite note, explaining that she was not cut out for ranch life. He had not blamed her. He had put the hair comb in the top drawer of his bureau and not looked at it since. So in early March he had done the thing that plenty of ranchers in the territory were doing in those years. He had placed an advertisement in 2 different newspapers, one in St. Louis and one in Kansas City, describing himself and his property and his situation with the same spare, no-nonsense economy he applied to everything in his life. Established cattle rancher, New Mexico territory, age 31, seeks wife of good character and strong constitution. Ranch life is hard but honest. The right woman would not go without. serious inquiries only. He had not expected much. He had half expected nothing at all. And then the letters had started coming, a trickle at first and then a small flood, from women of various ages and circumstances and levels of desperation. And he had read each one carefully and politely set each one aside because not a single word in any of them struck him as true. They were mostly carefully composed performances designed to sound appealing, and Elias, who had spent his life around livestock and weather and honest labor, had a highly developed sensitivity to anything that was not genuine. Until the letter from Clara Whitmore. She was 24 years old, she wrote, and she lived in St. Louis, where she had been working for the past 3 years as a seamstress in a large clothing establishment on Market Street. Her mother had died when she was 12. Her father, a riverboat worker, had remarried a woman who was not unkind but who had made it clear in 100 small ways over many years that Clara's presence in the household was a complication rather than a comfort. She had 2 younger half-siblings whom she loved but who did not need her the way a child needs someone. She was not wealthy. She was not, she wrote with what he could only interpret as wry honesty, particularly beautiful in the classical sense, though she had been told she had good eyes. She knew how to cook and keep a house and mend clothing. She did not know much about cattle or horses, but she was not afraid of work, and she was not afraid of learning. She had read about the New Mexico territory, and she thought it sounded like a place where a person could matter, where the work you did with your hands actually changed something in the world around you. She was tired of the city and its noise and its indifference. She wanted something real. She wrote the whole thing in a plain and direct hand with very few flourishes, and she made no promises about herself that she seemed uncertain she could keep. At the bottom she had written, almost as an afterthought, "I should tell you that am not coming west out of pure romantic notions. Am coming, if you'll have me, because I genuinely believe there is a life there worth building, and I believe I am capable of building it. Whether I am capable of building it with you specifically remains to be seen by both of us. Think honesty is the only fair beginning." Elias had read that letter 4 times in a row at his kitchen table, and then he had folded it very carefully and put it in his shirt pocket and kept it there for 2 days before writing back. They had exchanged 6 letters over the following 6 weeks. His letters were short and factual and probably, he worried, somewhat bleak in their straightforwardness. He told her the truth about the ranch, how far it was from town, how hard the winters could be, how the work never really stopped, how some years were good and some years the cattle did poorly and money grew tight. He told her the house was comfortable but not fancy. He told her he was not a demonstrative man and that he was aware of it as a shortcoming. He told her he would try to be fair to her in every way he knew how. Her letters back were warmer but never sentimental in a hollow way. She asked good questions. She asked about the water situation, about whether there was a doctor in town, about what the nearest school was like in case children came eventually, which she said she hoped they would, and she said it plainly and without embarrassment. She asked him what he read, and when he answered that he read mostly agricultural almanacs and occasionally the Bible, and once in a while a novel when he could get one, she wrote back that she approved of this mix entirely, and that she would bring her own small collection of books, and he was welcome to all of them. By the 6th letter they had agreed that she would come. He had sent money for the train fare from St. Louis to Santa Fe and from there by stagecoach to Red Rock Crossing, and she had written back a simple acknowledgement. "I will arrive on the 15th of May, God willing, and the creek don't rise. I look forward to meeting you in person, Mr. Calloway. Hope we find that the letters have been an honest introduction." He had read that last line 3 times, and something in his chest had shifted in a way he did not have words for. That was the letter that had made his hands shake. Now it was the 3rd of May, and there were 12 days to wait, and Elias Calloway was behaving in ways that would have been unrecognizable to anyone who had known him for the past decade. He cleaned the ranch house from top to bottom, with a thoroughness that left Diego watching from the doorway, with an expression of carefully concealed amusement. He had Coy Beaumont replace 2 window panes that had been cracked since the previous October. He patched the front porch boards where they had gone soft and split. He had Willie Hatch haul 3 loads of firewood and stack it neatly against the side of the house, even though May in New Mexico was not generally cold. He ordered new curtains from the general store, plain white cotton ones, and spent an uncomfortable evening figuring out how to hang them. He planted a small kitchen garden at the back of the house, something he had never done before, on the theory that a woman who baked and cooked might want fresh vegetables, which he realized only after several moments of self-examination was more an act of anticipation than practical necessity. Diego watched all of this with the patient observation of a man who has seen a great deal of life, and occasionally he would catch Elias looking at the road to town with an expression he had never seen on that stoic face before, something raw and uncertain and almost frightened, and Diego would look away quickly and say nothing, because some things a man has to come to on his own. The 15th of May arrived on a clear blue morning, the kind of morning the territory specialized in, the sky so vast and bright it made you feel simultaneously very small and very alive. Elias was up before sunrise. He shaved carefully, which he did not always do on weekdays. He put on his good shirt, the dark blue one he kept for church and the occasional trip into town on business. He stood in front of the small mirror in his room and looked at himself for a longer moment than he usually would, and came away from the experience with a feeling that was not quite confidence, but that he supposed would have to do. He hitched the wagon and drove into town by 8 o'clock, though the stagecoach from Santa Fe was not due until 1 in the afternoon. He spent the intervening hours at the general store with Harlan Gibbs, who ran it, and who was a cheerful and nosy man who knew perfectly well why Elias Calloway was sitting in his establishment on a Wednesday morning, when he should have been working cattle. "Mail-order bride," Harlan said with the satisfied tone of a man confirming a rumor. "Heard from my wife you'd placed the advertisement back in the winter. From St. Louis, is she?" "She is," Elias said, and his tone made it quite clear that the information exchange was complete. Harlan had the wisdom to talk about cattle prices for the rest of the morning. The stagecoach rolled into Reed Rock Crossing at 12 minutes past 1, trailing a cloud of dust and the rattling percussion of its iron-shod wheels on the dry road. 3 people climbed out, 2 men who were clearly traveling through to somewhere else and who immediately headed toward the saloon, and a woman. She stood in the bright midday sun and looked around at the town with the slightly stunned expression of someone who has just traveled a very long way and has arrived somewhere that is both more and less than they expected simultaneously. She was of medium height, with dark hair pinned up under a plain traveling hat, and a face that was, precisely as she had written, not classically beautiful but arresting in a way that had nothing to do with classical standards. Her eyes were dark brown and very steady, and even from across the street, even through the dust the stagecoach had kicked up, Elias could see that she was taking everything in with a focused, thoughtful attention that reminded him for a strange moment of the way he watched weather coming in from the mountains. She had a single large trunk and a carpet bag, both of which the driver was already unloading. She thanked the driver by name, which meant she had learned it during the journey, which told Elias something about her right there. He crossed the street. "Miss Whitmore," he said. She turned and looked at him, and for a moment neither of them said anything. The main street of Reed Rock Crossing went about its business around them, a wagon going past, 2 men talking outside the saloon, a dog crossing the road in no particular hurry. "Mr. Calloway," she said. Her voice was clear and a little lower than he had expected. She put out her hand and he shook it, and her grip was firm. "Good journey?" he asked. "Long," she said honestly. The last stretch from Santa Fe felt like it would never end. But the country is extraordinary. I had not understood from the descriptions how big the sky would be. He looked up at the sky, which he had stopped consciously noticing years ago, and tried to see it the way she was seeing it. "It's always like that," he said. "I imagine one gets used to it," she said. "I hope not entirely." He picked up her trunk, which was heavier than it looked, and she picked up her carpet bag. He led her to the wagon, and they loaded the trunk into the back, and he helped her up to the seat, and then they were driving out of town toward the ranch. They talked during the drive, carefully, the way two people talk when they are trying to figure out who the other one actually is. She asked about the cattle, and he told her. She asked about the land, and he told her. She asked about Diego and Willie and Coy, and he described each of them with a quiet affection he was not entirely aware of. She told him a little about St. Louis, about the river and the noise and the crowds, and he listened without saying much, but he listened completely. The road was dusty, and the wagon rattled, and the sun was warm without being vicious yet. And by the time the broken spur came into view, the low stone ranch house with its new curtains visible in the windows, and the smell of the stock from the barns and the big red ridge behind it catching the afternoon light, something between them had relaxed slightly, as if they had both been holding a breath and had let some of it out. "It's lovely," she said, and she meant it, and he could tell she meant it, and something in his chest did that shifting thing again. Diego came out to meet them as they pulled up, and Willie and Coy appeared from the direction of the barn, and there was a brief round of introductions during which Clara shook each man's hand and said something distinct and individual to each of them, asking Diego how long he had worked the broken spur, complimenting Willie on the neat stack of firewood she had noticed on the way in, and asking Coy with a completely straight face whether he found that his name caused any complications, which made Coy, who was 22 and shy, turn scarlet and then laugh unexpectedly, which seemed to be what she had intended. Diego met Elias's eyes over the top of Clara's head and gave him a look of unmistakable assessment, and then a very small nod, and Elias looked away before his expression could say anything he was not ready to commit to. The Reverend Gideon Marsh had been contacted in advance, and the wedding ceremony took place the following afternoon in the small white church. It was a simple affair, witnessed by Diego and Harlan Gibbs and Harlan's wife, Mary, who had brought a small cake she had baked that morning, and who cried cheerfully through the entire 10 minutes of the ceremony. Elias stood at the altar in his blue shirt and his good hat held in front of him, and Clara stood beside him in a dress of dark green wool that she had made herself, which fit her with the precision of a woman who spent her working days understanding how fabric falls on the human form. She said her vows in that clear, steady voice, looking directly at him the whole time, and he said his in a voice that did not quite shake, looking directly back at her. And when the Reverend Marsh pronounced them husband and wife, and Elias leaned down and pressed his lips briefly and carefully to hers, it was the most aware of another person he had been in years. She tasted faintly of the coffee Mary Gibbs had pressed on her that morning, and her hand, which rested on his arm, was warm. The first weeks of their marriage were a process of learning, careful and sometimes awkward, and occasionally funny in ways that neither of them had quite anticipated. She learned the rhythms of the ranch with a methodical intelligence that impressed the ranch hands and quietly astonished Elias, who had expected a longer adjustment period. She was up before dawn every morning, had the kitchen fire going and breakfast started before he came in from checking on the stock with Diego. She learned the names of every cow in the herd within the first 2 weeks, which was not strictly necessary, and which he found, privately, remarkable. She established a kitchen garden that was already beginning to show green shoots by the end of May. She mended the curtains in the front room that he had hung crookedly, and had not told him she was going to fix, so that he walked in one evening and they were simply hanging right, and he stood there for a moment trying to figure out what was different. She also brought her books, a small collection of perhaps 20 volumes that she arranged on a shelf in the front room, and on the evenings when the work was done and the fire was burning low, she would sometimes read while he went over accounts or read the almanac, and the presence of another person in the room doing something quiet and purposeful was a comfort he had not known he was missing until it was there. They were still getting used to each other. That was the honest truth of it. The marriage bed was not uncomfortable, but it was tentative, two people being careful not to presume too much too soon, and he respected that in her, and he thought she respected it in him, though they did not talk about it. They talked about a lot of other things. The cattle, the weather, the garden, the people in town, about whom Clara had already formed a set of shrewd and often gently comic observations that she shared over dinner in a way that made Elias, who had not laughed easily in years, find himself doing so more often than he expected. She caught him watching her sometimes in the kitchen or out in the yard, and she would look up and meet his eyes, and there would be a moment between them that was not quite comfortable and not quite uncomfortable, but something else, something charged and warm, and then one of them would look away and the moment would pass. He wanted to say things to her that he did not know how to say. It was on a Wednesday evening at the end of May, about 10 days after the wedding, that the difficulty arrived, in the form of a man named Bart Caulfield. Bart Caulfield was one of 3 Caulfield brothers who ran a spread about 12 miles to the south, and they were the kind of people about whom Reedrock Crossing had long maintained a collective, careful silence, the way a town maintains silence about a thing that is unpleasant but that no one feels quite equipped to address. The Caulfields were not outlaws in any formal sense. They had never been arrested or charged. But they operated their ranch in a fashion that left neighboring ranchers consistently nervous about their fence lines and their cattle counts, and they had a reputation for settling disputes in ways that the law, in the person of Sheriff Holt McCready, could rarely quite find enough evidence to act upon. Bart was the middle brother, 36, thick through the chest, with a blunt face and the particular kind of confidence that comes not from competence, but from the absence of any internal governor. He had come into town on some business of his own and had apparently heard about Elias Calloway's new wife, because he rode out to the Broken Spur the following Thursday afternoon without any particular invitation, and presented himself at the front door while Elias was out on the North Range with Diego. Clara answered the door. She told Elias about it that evening over supper, matter-of-factly, without drama, the way she told him most things. "A man named Caulfield came by," she said. "Said he wanted to welcome me to the territory. He was not particularly well-mannered about it. He stood in the doorway without being invited in, and he said things that were meant to be complimentary but weren't, and he looked around the house in a way that I didn't like." She paused and passed him the bread. "Told him you were not available, and I closed the door." Elias put down his fork. "He say anything else?" He asked. "He said he hoped to see more of me in town," Clara said. "He said it in a way that was intended to make me uncomfortable. I was, a little. Mostly I was irritated." Elias looked at his wife across the supper table, at her steady dark eyes and the set of her jaw, and he felt something hot and protective rise in him that he did not entirely like acknowledging because it required him to admit how much he already cared. "I'll speak to him," he said. "I'd rather you not make trouble over it," she said. "Can manage men like that." "I don't doubt it," he said, and he meant it. "But he needs to understand that this is my household and he's not welcome here uninvited." He spoke to Bart Caulfield 2 days later in town at the general store. The conversation was brief and controlled and conducted in voices too low for anyone nearby to overhear, though Harlan Gibbs did his absolute best. Elias said what needed to be said. Bart Caulfield smiled the whole time, the kind of smile that does not reach anywhere near the eyes, and said he had only meant to be neighborly, and Elias said he appreciated the sentiment and trusted it would not be repeated. There was a silence that lasted about 4 seconds and contained a significant amount of information, and then Caulfield touched the brim of his hat and walked away. It was not the end of it, but it was a beginning of the boundary, and for the time being it held. June came in hot and golden. The cattle were doing well. The grass on the broken spur was good this year, better than the previous two, and Diego was quietly pleased with the calf numbers. Clara's kitchen garden was flourishing in the way that certain gardens do when tended by someone who pays genuine attention to them, and the addition of fresh tomatoes and green beans and summer squash to the supper table made a noticeable improvement to the general quality of ranch life that even Willie Hatch, who was not given to enthusiasm about vegetables, acknowledged openly. Clara had also begun going into town twice a week, on Tuesdays and Fridays, partly for supplies and partly because she had quickly identified herself as a person of practical use to the community. Mary Gibbs had discovered that Clara could not only sew but could cut patterns and fit garments with a professional skill that had not previously existed in Redrock Crossing, and word spread among the women of the town with remarkable speed. Within 3 weeks Clara had taken on 4 small commissions, mending and alterations, and 1 new dress for the hardware merchant's wife, and she did them in the evenings at the kitchen table, and set the income aside in a small tin she kept on the shelf, which she told Elias was for unexpected expenses, and which he told her she could do with as she pleased. Elias drove her to town on those Tuesday and Friday mornings and picked her up in the late afternoon, and while he waited he sometimes sat with Diego on the porch and went over the books, and sometimes he just sat with a cup of coffee and watched the Main Street go about its business and thought about his wife, which was something he was doing with increasing frequency. She made him laugh. That was not something he had expected, and it was not a small thing. She had a dry and precise sense of humor that operated at a frequency he understood immediately, and the things she noticed about the world, the way she could describe a person or a situation with 3 words that laid it completely bare, this delighted something in him that had not been delighted in a very long time. She was also, he had come to understand, braver than she let on. She did not complain about the heat or the isolation or the occasional loneliness that he knew she must feel. She simply absorbed the difficulties and kept working. He was not sure when he understood that he was in love with her. It was not a single moment but an accumulation of them, like the way water rises in a cistern, slowly and then suddenly. It might have been the morning he watched her from the barn doorway as she stood in the kitchen garden with her sleeves rolled up, frowning thoughtfully at a row of beans and talking to them under her breath as if they needed instruction. It might have been the evening she had read aloud to him from one of her books, a novel by Mr. Mark Twain that she had brought from St. Louis, and had stopped reading at a particularly funny passage because she was laughing too hard to continue. It might have been the night in late June when a thunderstorm had rolled in off the mountains with enough violence to rattle the windows, and she had come out of the bedroom in her nightgown and stood in the front room watching it through the window, and he had come to stand beside her, and she had said quietly, "I never knew thunder could sound like that out here, like it means something personal," and he had understood exactly what she meant. Whatever the accumulation of moments, by July, he knew what he felt, and the knowledge was accompanied by a discomfort that was entirely self-directed, because knowing what he felt required him to confront what he believed about his own worthiness of it. This was the thing Elias Calloway had never told anyone, not Diego, not his brother Tom, not any person living or dead. He had a low estimation of himself that had nothing to do with his work or his competence, and everything to do with the private conviction that he was not enough of something to be loved the way a person should be loved. His father had been a man of few words but of great warmth in private, and his mother had loved them both loudly and without reservation, and when they died, the house had gone so quiet that Elias had concluded in some wordless and fundamental way that the warmth had gone with them, that the capacity for it had belonged to them rather than to him, that he was the cold remainder. He had buried himself in the work of the ranch because work was something he was objectively good at, and he had done without the rest. And then Clara had come. And now the warmth was back in the house, her warmth. And the question that tormented him through the long hot July evenings, while she read, and he pretended to read and actually thought about her, was whether she had any idea that she was wasting it on a man who did not know how to return it properly. He watched her make friends with the women in town, and he watched how easy it was for her, how natural, and he thought about the social ease she could have in a city, the life she might have had, and he thought about the particular quality of the life she had traded it for, the isolation and the hardness and the particular company of Elias Calloway, and the arithmetic of it seemed to him to work out very poorly in his favor. He was not good at saying any of this. He was not good at saying most personal things. But he showed it, he hoped, in the ways he knew how to show anything, in making sure the house was warm and the lamp was full of oil in the evenings, in driving her to town and waiting without complaint, in mending the fence along the south pasture so the cattle would not wander through the garden she had worked so hard on, in the steady and faithful attention he paid to everything she needed without being asked. She saw it. He could tell she saw it, from the way she sometimes looked at him, a long, thoughtful look that was measuring something he could not identify, but she did not say much about it either. They were both, he realized, people who spoke more easily in actions than in words, which meant there were things between them that were accumulating in the silence and which would eventually need air. The confrontation with Bart Caulfield came again in late July, and this time it was more serious. Elias had ridden into town on a Monday to settle an account at the hardware store when he heard from Harlan Gibbs that Caulfield had been asking around about the broken spur, specifically about how much of Elias's north pasture was deeded and how much was grazing land operating on a territorial permit. This was a pointed question because the territorial land situation in New Mexico in 1882 was complicated, with large tracts of land whose legal status was uncertain due to old Spanish land grant questions and the haphazard nature of frontier record-keeping. And Elias knew immediately that Caulfield was probing for weakness in his land position. He went to speak to Sheriff McReady, who listened with the tired patience of a man who has heard variations of the same story many times. "I know about the Caulfields," McReady said, leaning back in his chair and looking at the ceiling. "I have known about the Caulfields for 6 years. The problem, as it always is that knowing and proving are different things." "He's sniffing around my land titles," Elias said. "Then make sure your titles are clean," McReady said. "If they are, he's got nothing. If there's any question, I'd get yourself to Santa Fe and speak to the Territorial Land Office before Caulfield does." Elias rode home that evening in a foul temper that he kept carefully off his face, but that Clara detected immediately over supper because she was perceptive in ways that he was still discovering. "What happened in town?" she asked. He told her the whole of it, the land question and the Caulfields and the sheriff's advice, because he had discovered that he could not dissemble with her effectively and had mostly stopped trying. She listened without interrupting. "How solid are your titles?" she asked when he finished. "Mostly solid," he said. "The north pasture is the question. My father expanded onto it in 1868 on a grazing permit, and we've been operating on it without legal challenge for 14 years, but I haven't been to Santa Fe to verify the status of that permit in the past 4 years. "Then we should go," she said simply. He looked at her across the table. "It's a 2-day ride to Santa Fe," he said. "I know," she said. "Came through it on the stage. It's an excellent city. I'll make a list of things we need from the shops while we're there." She began clearing the plates. "When can we leave?" He sat looking at the empty table for a moment, and then he got up and began helping her clear, which was another habit he had developed since her arrival that his father would have found startling, and that felt completely natural to him now. They went to Santa Fe the following week, leaving Diego in charge of the broken spur with Willie and Coy. The journey took 2 days each way by wagon, and they stayed 2 nights at a respectable boarding house on San Francisco Street, a fact that required them to spend time in closer quarters than they usually managed on the ranch, where the house was large enough to allow each of them private space. The first evening in Santa Fe, they had supper together at a restaurant that Clara admired for its tiled floors and its cooking, and they talked for 2 hours straight without either of them running out of things to say, which was remarkable to Elias, because he had spent most of his adult life having supper alone in 10 minutes and getting back to work. She told him about her childhood in St. Louis, more of it than she had shared in the letters, about the particular loneliness of being a daughter whose mother had died and whose father had moved forward without looking back too carefully, and how she had learned very early to be self-sufficient because no one else was particularly invested in her sufficiency. He listened to all of it with the complete attention he gave to things that mattered, and when she finished, the table was quiet for a moment. "You did not have an easy start," he said. "No," she agreed, "but I did not have a terrible one either. I had books and I had work and I had enough sense to know that neither of those was permanent and that eventually I'd have to make something different." She looked at him steadily across the candle-lit table. "I don't regret the choice I made," she said. "Coming here. Coming to the ranch. Want you to know that." He held her gaze for a long moment. "I'm glad," he said, and the word was so insufficient for what he meant that he almost laughed at himself, but she seemed to hear the whole of what was behind it anyway, because her expression softened in a way he had come to recognize and love. The business at the Territorial Land Office the following morning was successful. Elias's father had, in fact, filed the necessary conversion paperwork for the North Pasture in 1871, and the documentation was on file, properly registered, which meant the land was his outright. He came out of the land office into the bright Santa Fe morning with the papers in his hand and Clara standing on the steps, and when he showed her what they said, she read them quickly and looked up with an expression of pure, unguarded relief and satisfaction. "Good," she said. "Bart Caulfield can manage without your North Pasture." "He can," Elias agreed, and the relief and the satisfaction were also in him, and they stood in the Santa Fe morning and laughed about it together, which was not what he had expected the resolution of a land dispute to feel like, but there it was. On the second night in Santa Fe, sitting on the small balcony of the boarding house after supper with a lantern between them and the sounds of the city below, Clara said something that caught him off guard. "Are you happy, Elias?" He sat with the question for a moment, because he was not in the habit of asking or being asked this question, and because he wanted to answer it honestly rather than reflexively. "Yes," he said finally. "More than I expected to be." She turned the lantern's handle with one finger, a small nervous gesture he had learned to notice. "I want you to know," she said, "that I know you did not expect much when you placed that advertisement, and I know you were surprised by me. Could tell from the beginning, and I want you to know that I am not here as a convenience. I'm here because I chose to be here and I keep choosing it, every day." He looked at her, the lantern light catching the angles of her face, the steadiness in her dark eyes. "I know that," he said quietly. "Do you?" she asked, and there was a careful precision in the question that told him it mattered. "I'm beginning to," he said, which was truer than yes, and she seemed to know the difference. She reached across the small table and put her hand over his, very simply, and he turned his hand over and held hers, and they sat like that for a while listening to the Santa Fe night, and it was one of the most complete and uncomplicated moments of his adult life. August arrived with an unrelenting heat that turned the broken spur into a landscape of amber and dust, the air shimmering above the stock tanks, and the cattle moving in slow, heavy congregations toward whatever shade they could find. Elias worked from before sunup until after sundown, keeping the water moving and the cattle from pressing fences. Clara managed the house and the garden with the same fierce practicality she brought to everything, setting up a shade canopy over the more delicate plants and hauling water from the well in the cool of the early morning. They had settled into a domestic rhythm that felt, to Elias, like something he had never known he was missing and could now not imagine being without. She made coffee the way he liked it without being asked after the first week. He made sure the lamp in the front room was always full of oil for her evening reading. She sometimes came out to the barn in the early evening and sat on a hay bale and talked to him while he did the final check on the stock. And those conversations, in the warm barn smell of hay and horse and cattle, were some of the best conversations he could remember having in his life. He had begun to realize, in the way that genuinely important realizations often come, not as a flash but as a slowly brightening understanding, that he did not just care for her practically and feel warmly toward her as a companion. He loved her, fully and completely and without reservation, in the way that books described and that he had always vaguely assumed was an exaggeration. It was not an exaggeration. It was a fact, as verifiable and solid as the deed to the north pasture, and with the fact came the fear. The fear was specific and had a specific shape. It went like this. Clara Whitmore was intelligent and capable and warm and funny and good in a way that was not small or ordinary. And she had chosen this life partly because she was resourceful and determined, and partly because she had not had better options presented to her. And someday, perhaps soon, she would. Look around at the life she had chosen and realize that she was worth considerably more than a taciturn rancher who could not say what he felt, and a 2,000-acre cattle operation in the New Mexico territory. And she would be right, and there would be nothing he could do about it. He turned this fear over in his mind through August like a stone in a river, wearing it smooth without dissolving it. It came to a head on a Sunday evening in early September, when the heat had broken slightly, and the mountains to the north were showing the first faint reddening that announced the coming of autumn. They had been to church that morning, which they did most Sundays, and Clara had talked with the women of the congregation afterward with the easy warmth she always brought to these exchanges, and Elias had stood slightly to one side watching her, and feeling something so large and ungainly in his chest that he was surprised it didn't show on his face. They had come home and had a quiet dinner, and afterward Clara was sitting in the front room with one of her books and Elias was standing at the front window looking out at the ridge, which was catching the last of the late afternoon light in shades of copper and rose that were particular to September in this country. "Elias," she said, without looking up from her book. "Yes," he said. "Sit down," she said. "You've been standing at that window for 20 minutes and you're making the room feel restless." He sat down in the chair across from her. She put a finger in her book to mark the page and looked at him. "What is it?" she said. He looked at her, at his wife, in the lamp-warmed front room that smelled of the dried sage she had put in a jar on the shelf, and the coffee from earlier and the faint cedar smell of the beams, and everything he had been turning over in his mind for weeks came to the edge of his mouth. "You deserve better than me," he told her. The words fell into the room and landed there, and for a moment neither of them moved. She looked at him with an expression he could not immediately read, that measuring look she sometimes turned on him. "Explain that," she said. "You're educated," he said, the words coming now in the flat, deliberate way he said all the things that cost him. "You're clever and you're capable and you're warm in ways that I am not, and you could have had a different life. In a city, with a man who could give you more than this." He gestured at the room, at the house, at the ranch beyond it, meaning not the things but himself. "Am not easy to know and am not good at saying things, and I know you sit here some evenings and you must wonder how different it might have been." She was quiet for a moment that felt very long. And then the mail-order bride's answer left the cowboy speechless. "Elias Calloway," she said, and her voice was clear and entirely steady. You are, without question, the most frustrating man I have ever encountered in my life." He blinked. "You have just told me," she continued, setting her book down on the table beside her with a precision that suggested she was choosing her words with the same care, "that I deserve better than you. As though you have some authority over what I deserve that supersedes my own understanding of it. As though in the 4 months I have been here, watching you work yourself half to death for this land that you love, and watching you be fair and honest and decent to every person who crosses your path, and watching you put oil in my lamp every evening without being asked because you noticed that I like to read and you wanted me to be able to, have somehow failed to form any useful opinion about who you are." She paused. "Have not failed to form an opinion. Have formed a very thorough one." He sat in his chair with nothing to say. "You are not easy to know," she said. "That is true. But I have known you, Elias, and the knowing has not made me want a different answer. It has made me want to know more." She looked at him very directly. "And as for what I could have had, in a city, with some other man who is better at talking about himself, I want you to think very carefully about whether what you are describing sounds like it would have been better or whether it would simply have been different, and whether different is the same as better. Because from where I sit it is not." He opened his mouth and closed it again. "You said you are not good at saying things," she said, and her voice shifted, becoming something warmer, the heat of it reaching across the room and touching him like a hand. "That's true too. But Elias, you say things constantly. You say things every single morning when the fire is already going and the coffee is already made. You say things when you mended that fence along the south pasture, and you thought I didn't notice that you did it because of my garden. You say things when you drove me all the way to Santa Fe and sat in that land office for 3 hours so that Bart Caulfield could not threaten what we have built." She stopped. Her voice was entirely steady, but her eyes were bright. "Have heard every single thing you have said, everyone, and they have added up to more than most men say in a lifetime of talking." The room was very quiet. "I love this life," she said. "I love this ranch, and I love that big ridiculous sky, and I love Diego, and I love the kitchen garden, and I love the books on that shelf, and I love that you read them. Yes, you do. I have noticed the bookmark moving. I love all of it." She looked at him. "And I love you, Elias. Have loved you since approximately the moment you helped me out of that wagon and looked at the sky to try to see what I was seeing." He stared at her. He had been prepared, in the dim and complicated way that he prepared himself for things, for her to agree with him. He had been prepared for her to say that yes, perhaps she had been thinking about it. He had been prepared for the weight of the truth of his own inadequacy to be confirmed. He had not been prepared for any single word of what she had just said. He got up from his chair and crossed the room and sat on the sofa beside her and took her face in both his hands, which were large and calloused and probably not as gentle as they should have been, but she put her own hands over his and held them there. "Clara," he said, and her name alone was the entirety of what he could manage. "I know," she said very softly. "I love you," he said. "I have loved you for months, and I have been afraid to say it because I was afraid you would agree that I was not worth it." "Oh, Elias," she said, and the way she said his name did something to him that reorganized the interior landscape of his life. He kissed her properly for the first time in a way that was nothing like the careful, brief kiss of the wedding ceremony, and she kissed him back with the same directness and warmth she brought to everything, and the September evening settled around the Broken Spur Ranch like a blessing. October came in cool and bright, the cottonwoods along the creek turning gold, the ridge above the ranch going russet and ochre against the tremendous blue of the sky. The cattle were in good condition going toward winter. The hay was cut and stored. The repairs on the house were all done. The kitchen garden had been put to rest for the season, the last of the tomatoes canned in glass jars that lined the kitchen shelf in satisfying rows, and the Broken Spur was the happiest it had been in a long time. This was Diego's opinion, which he expressed to Willie Hatch one evening at the bunkhouse with complete economy. "That woman is good for him," Diego said. Willie, who was stirring the remnants of his supper, considered this. "Reckon so," he said. "He smiles now." "He does," Diego said. This was not entirely untrue. Elias Calloway had not been observed to be a man who smiled easily or often, but something had shifted in him since the September evening that Clara had said what she had said, something fundamental and irreversible. He was still not a demonstrative man in public. He still spoke with the same economical directness that characterized everything he did. But there was something easier about him, something lighter, as if he had been carrying a weight for a long time and had finally been convinced to put it down. In private, he was completely different. In private, he told her things, slowly and not always gracefully, but he told them, because she had made it clear that she heard everything and that the telling mattered. He told her about his parents and about Tom and about the years of quiet after they were all gone. He told her about the fear he had carried about himself, the specific and paralyzing conviction that he was not enough for anything warm and real. She listened to all of it with the same complete and steady attention she gave everything, and she did not rush to reassure him or smooth over the difficult parts, which was exactly right, because he did not need smoothing, he needed to be heard. In return, she told him more of herself, things that had not made it into the letters or even the candlelit Santa Fe evenings, the small and specific things that make up a person's inner life. She told him what she wanted for the future. She wanted to keep the sewing work, not because they needed the income, though it helped, but because she liked the work itself, and because it connected her to the women in town in a way that felt valuable. She wanted to expand the kitchen garden next spring, to try growing corn and try her hand at the apple saplings she had seen at the nursery in Santa Fe, and which she thought might survive the altitude at the broken spur if she planted them in the right sheltered spot. She wanted, when the time was right, to have children, 2 or 3 if the Lord was willing, and she wanted them to grow up on this land under this sky with this particular kind of space around them. He listened to all of it and realized that every single thing she wanted was also something he wanted, precisely because she wanted it, and that this alignment of wanting was the most extraordinary thing he had experienced. Bart Caulfield made one more appearance in their lives in November, and it was, finally, the one that ended it. He had apparently approached the Territorial Land Office in Santa Fe on his own initiative and discovered that the Broken Spurs North pasture title was solid, which had presumably been a disappointment. He had then, according to the report that eventually reached Elias through Diego, who had heard it from a man in town who had heard it from the farrier, attempted to buy out a note on a small property adjacent to the Broken Spurs southern fence that was held by an older woman named Mrs. Agnes Pell, a widow of 70 who had a few acres and a small adobe house and a vegetable plot. The idea, evidently, was to establish a foothold next to Elias's land through Mrs. Pell's property. What Caulfield had apparently not accounted for was that Agnes Pell had absolutely no intention of selling anything to anyone, least of all Bart Caulfield, and that she had the particular brand of iron-spined stubbornness that certain old women of the frontier developed after a lifetime of managing everything on their own, and that when Caulfield pushed, she sent for Sheriff Macready and filed a formal complaint about harassment. Macready had finally, with the Pell incident added to a growing file that included 3 other formal complaints from other neighbors that had accumulated over the years, enough to take to the district judge in Santa Fe. And by the end of November, the Caulfield brothers were looking at a legal proceeding that was going to take considerable time and money and attention, and would keep them very occupied with their own affairs for the foreseeable future. Clara heard about this in town on a Tuesday from Mary Gibbs, who told it with considerable relish, and she came home and told Elias over supper, and he listened to the whole of it and then sat quietly for a moment. "Good for Agnes Pell," he said finally. Absolutely, Clara said, and served him more potatoes, and that was that. The winter of 1882 moving into 1883 was cold but not brutal, at least by New Mexico Territory standards. The cattle weathered it well. The hay held. The woodpile was more than adequate. The house was warm. Clara had turned one of the smaller rooms in the house, which had been used for storage, into a sewing room, and she could often be found there in the afternoons, the sound of her work coming softly through the wall while Elias did the accounts at the kitchen table or read by the fire. He liked the sound of it, the specific domestic presence of it, and sometimes he would stand in the doorway and watch her work, and she would look up, and they would look at each other for a moment, and something would pass between them that was completely wordless and entirely sufficient. They had a tradition now, in the evenings, of reading aloud to each other by the fire. It had started one evening in November when she was reading something that made her laugh until she cried, and she had simply begun reading it aloud to him, and he had listened and laughed with her, and after that it became the thing they did. They had gotten through 2 of Mr. Twain's books and were working their way through a collection of essays, and had acquired a new novel from the bookshop in Santa Fe on their second visit there in October. On a cold evening in January, with the fire burning high and the wind pushing at the eaves and the first faint snow dusting the ridge, Clara put down the book they had been reading mid-chapter. "I think I'm going to have a baby," she said. He looked at her. "You think?" He said, "I'm fairly certain," she said. "I have been paying attention to certain signals for the past 3 weeks, and I am fairly certain." She paused. "I should have doctor. Prentice confirm it, but am fairly certain." He sat looking at her for a long moment in which the fire crackled and the wind pushed, and the world outside the windows was cold and white, and the world inside was warm and still. He got up from his chair and crossed the room and sat beside her on the sofa, and he took both her hands very carefully in both of his, and he looked at her with everything he felt entirely visible on his face, which was not something that had been true of him for most of his life. "Clara," he said. "Yes," she said, and she was smiling. "I'm going to say something, and I need you to hear all of it," he said. "I always hear all of it," she said. "I know," he said. "That is one of the many reasons why I love you." He held her hands a little more firmly. "When you came off that stagecoach in May, I stood there and I thought, she is going to take one look at this town and at me, and she is going to get right back on. And you didn't. And every day since then I have thought, today she will realize the arithmetic of it, today she will see clearly what she gave up, and every day she didn't, and every day I loved you more and was more afraid. And then you told me what you told me in this room in September, and I stopped being afraid." He paused. "I'm going to be a father, and I'm going to be a better one than I would have been a year ago, because you have shown me how to be less afraid of my own life. And I need you to know that." She looked at him for a long moment. "You would have been a good father regardless," she said, "because you are fundamentally a good man, Elias, and you always were. You just needed someone to stay long enough to demonstrate the fact to you." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "But I am glad it was me." He put his arm around her, and they sat by the fire listening to the winter outside, and the broken spur held them both safe inside its stone walls, and the night was long and quiet and entirely good. Dr. Prentice confirmed Clara's assessment in February, with the practiced calm of a frontier doctor who had learned to be cheerful about the things that were good without promising too much about the things that were uncertain. And he told them the baby would likely arrive in late August or early September, and he gave Clara instructions about rest and diet that she listened to with polite attention, and then implemented with the selective pragmatism of a woman who had a ranch to help run, and was not going to stop doing it because of a pregnancy. Spring came to the broken spur in a rush of green that always surprised Elias no matter how many times he had seen it. The way the land went from the winter browns and ochres to the sudden insistence of new grass in what felt like the space of a single warm week. Clara's apple saplings, which she had planted in February in a sheltered spot along the south wall of the barn, were showing the tentative green of new leaves. The kitchen garden was turned and planted. The cattle were cycling through calving with the usual combination of routine and occasional crisis. Clara was blooming in the particular way of pregnancy, the round curve of her belly becoming evident through April and unmistakable by May. And she continued to manage the house and the sewing work and her twice-weekly visits to town with complete equanimity, waving off Elias's periodic suggestions that she slow down with the precise and affectionate dismissal that she had developed for any suggestion she considered excessive. "I am not ill," she told him one morning when he offered to carry a basket she was perfectly capable of carrying. "And with child, these are different conditions." "I know that," he said. "Then let me carry my own basket," she said, and he did, though he walked close enough that she could hand it to him instantly if she chose to. She caught him smiling about this later and raised an eyebrow. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said, still smiling. "Elias Calloway, you are smiling about something," she said. "I'm smiling about you," he said, simply and without embarrassment, and she looked at him with that expression she had, the one that was warm and a little wondering, as if she still could not quite believe the distance he had traveled from the taciturn man she had stepped off the stagecoach to meet. He could not quite believe it either, if he was honest. But it was entirely real. Tom Calloway appeared at the Broken Spur in June, riding up the road from town on a chestnut horse with his saddle bags full, and his face browned from years of Texas sun, and looking enough like Elias that Diego recognized him from 100 yards away, and went to fetch his employer with an expression of quiet pleasure. Elias came out of the barn and stopped when he saw his brother, and for a moment he stood there with 4 years of absence and all the difficulty of brotherly feeling that he did not know how to articulate, and Tom got off his horse and they stood facing each other in the yard. "You look old," Tom said. "You look dusty," Elias said. They embraced briefly and awkwardly in the way of men who are deeply glad to see each other and have no vocabulary for the gladness. And then Tom stepped back and looked at the ranch house and at the new curtains and at the kitchen garden and at the apple saplings and at the general evidence of female habitation that had transformed the Broken Spur from a bachelor's operation into something else entirely. "So the letters were true," Tom said. "You got yourself a wife." "I did," Elias said. "She here." "In the kitchen," Elias said. "Come meet her." Clara met Tom Calloway at the kitchen door, her sleeves rolled up and a smear of flour on her forearm from the bread she was making, and she looked at him with those dark, observant eyes and said, "You must be Tom." "I'm Clara," and put out her floury hand, which Tom shook with a grin. "Elias described me?" Tom asked. "Not extensively," Clara said, "but I have read all of his letters to you over the past year and they described you adequately." Tom looked at his brother. "You read them to her?" he asked. "She asked," Elias said. Tom looked at Clara and then back at Elias and then at Clara again, and his grin got wider and he said, "I think you may have done the best thing you ever did in your life, brother." "I know it," Elias said. Tom stayed for 3 weeks. He slept in the front room and ate Clara's cooking and helped with the cattle during the day, and told stories in the evenings that filled the front room with laughter, stories about Texas, and the people he had met and the work he had done, told with the Calloway verbal economy, but with Tom's considerably more developed sense of the dramatic. Clara encouraged these stories enthusiastically, partly because she genuinely enjoyed them and partly because she had correctly identified that getting the Calloway brothers talking in each other's company required a certain amount of active facilitation, and she was good at facilitation. On the last evening before Tom left, when Clara had gone to bed early because the baby was sitting on her in a way that made the evening hours uncomfortable, Tom and Elias sat on the front porch with cups of coffee and the night sky above them, which was the New Mexico Territory night sky in full summer, which is to say it was the most dramatic roof the world has to offer. "She's good," Tom said. "Yes," Elias said. "Not just good for you," Tom said. "Good, full stop, good person." "I know," Elias said. "You love her," Tom said. "Yes," Elias said, and the word was entirely simple and entirely true. Tom looked at the stars for a moment. "Mama would have loved her," he said. Elias looked at the stars too. "Yes," he said, "she would have." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the way two people sit who have known each other their entire lives and have no need to fill the space between them. "I might come back," Tom said eventually, "permanently or close to it." "There's room," Elias said. "Always was." "I know," Tom said. "I wasn't ready before. Are you now?" Tom looked at the road and then back at the house. "Think I might be," he said. Tom rode out the next morning with his saddlebags and his chestnut horse and a portion of Clara's bread wrapped in cloth for the journey, and Clara stood in the yard and watched him go and said, "He'll be back," with the certainty of someone who has read a situation correctly. "Probably," Elias said. "Definitely," she said, and went back inside to her bread. August arrived, and with it the particular heavy heat of the territory in summer, and Clara grew larger and more deliberate in her movements, conducting the business of the house with the same efficiency, but at a slightly reduced pace that she did not acknowledge aloud. Elias moved around her with a careful attention that he tried to make unobtrusive, and that was entirely obvious to everyone, including Clara, who tolerated it with a grace that he appreciated. The night of the 28th of August, Clara woke him just after midnight with a hand on his arm and the quiet announcement that they needed to send for Dr. Prentice. He was out of bed and pulling on his boots before she had finished the sentence. He sent Coy Beaumont galloping for town on the fastest horse in the barn, and he came back and sat beside Clara and held her hand through the hours that followed, which were long and hard in the way that such hours always are, the kind of hours that require a particular quality of courage that is less dramatic than any other kind of courage, but no less real for that. And Clara had it in full measure, gripping his hand and breathing, and doing the work of it with a determined focus that he watched with something close to awe. Dr. Prentice arrived at 3 in the morning, and Diego's wife, a small and capable woman named Rosa, who had returned to the ranch with Diego after their marriage 2 years prior, and who had become indispensable to the household in ways that Clara never took for granted, helped him throughout. At 20 minutes past 5 in the morning, on the 29th of August, 1883, with the first light beginning to touch the red ridge above the broken spur, Elias Calloway's son entered the world at a healthy volume that suggested he was going to be a person of strong opinions. Elias held him for the first time a few minutes later, this small, red, furious person wrapped in flannel, and the feeling was entirely beyond the reach of any of his usual categories, vast and tender and almost frightening in its intensity. "He has your ears," Clara said from the bed, her voice exhausted and entirely content. Elias looked at her, his wife, worn and beautiful, and watching him hold their son with that particular expression he loved most, the one that was warm and knowing and entirely his. "What shall we call him?" Elias asked. She had thought about this. They had discussed names over the past months without settling. "James," she said, "after no one in particular. Just because it is a solid name for a person to carry through his life." "James," Elias said, looking at the baby, who was beginning to calm under the steady warmth of being held. "James Calloway." He looked up at his wife. "Yes." James Daniel Calloway was healthy and loud, and from the very beginning a person of considerable personality, which Clara said was inevitable given his heritage from both sides. Diego and Rosa were devoted to him in ways that made the bunkhouse a frequent first destination on any morning walk through the yard. Willie Hatch, who was 23 and beginning to think seriously about his own domestic future, was clearly affected by the presence of the baby in ways he would not have admitted, but that were visible to anyone who watched him soften when he thought no one was looking. Even Coy Beaumont, at 24, who had the lanky reserve of a man still becoming himself, would hold the baby with the particular careful intensity of the young who are not sure what they are feeling but feel it strongly. The autumn of 1883 was the best one Elias could remember. The Broken Spur had had a good year. The cattle were in excellent condition. The land titles were solid. The Caulfield legal proceedings in Santa Fe had resulted in a settlement that required the Caulfield brothers to pay significant fines and to stay off neighboring land, a resolution that was not perfect justice, but was considerably better than nothing, and that had, effectively, removed them as a practical threat. Agnes Pell was still in her adobe house with her vegetable plot and her remarkable stubbornness, and she had accepted an invitation to Sunday dinner at the Broken Spur with a dignity that suggested she had been expecting the invitation for some time. Clara's apple saplings had taken. By October of 1883, they were showing the growth that meant they had established proper root systems, and Clara stood in front of them in the October afternoon light with James on her hip and talked to them in the same undertone she had used on the kitchen garden beans. And Elias watched her from the barn doorway and felt the particular quality of love that is not passionate or urgent, but is as deep and permanent as the sandstone of the ridge above them. He walked out to stand beside her. "Talking to the apple trees again," he said. "They respond to conversation," she said completely seriously. "Is that a scientific fact?" "It is a Clara Calloway fact," she said. "Which is better?" James on her hip made a sound of strong agreement and reached for a branch. "Careful," Elias said automatically, moving to redirect the small determined hand, and Clara leaned her head briefly against his shoulder as she often did, the simple gesture that meant everything and required nothing. "Elias," she said. "Yes," he said. "Are you happy?" she asked. She had asked him this before, on the balcony in Santa Fe more than a year ago, and the asking now was the same question but different, warmer, informed by everything that had happened between the two askings. He stood in the October afternoon on the land he loved with his wife and his son and the growing apple trees and the red ridge catching the last of the sun and the sound of the cattle and the smoke starting from the bunkhouse chimney where Rosa was cooking supper. "Yes," he said. It was the same answer he had given in Santa Fe, but it meant something larger now, something with roots deep enough to hold through any winter. She turned and looked at him with those dark eyes, and in them he could see everything she was and everything they had built together. And he leaned down and kissed her in the October afternoon among the apple trees, while James watched with the focused interest of a baby, discovering that the world contains a great deal that is warm and right. By the following spring, Clara was showing the early signs of a second pregnancy, which she announced at dinner one April evening with the same matter-of-fact directness she brought to all significant announcements, and Elias received the news with the same complete and unguarded joy he had felt the first time, but without any of the fear, because the fear had been put down in a September evening in the front room of the Broken Spur and had not been picked up again. Tom Calloway did come back, as Clara had known he would, arriving in March of 1884 with a more settled look about him, and his saddle bags packed for permanence, and a shy acknowledgment that he had been thinking about the Broken Spur for months and had decided it was where he was supposed to be. Elias gave him the room that had been their father's study, and they renegotiated the ranch operation to include him formally, which was a conversation conducted with the spare directness that characterized all Calloway business, and which ended with both brothers satisfied and the understanding clear. Clara, for her part, greeted Tom's permanent return with what she described to Mary Gibbs as significant relief, on the grounds that Elias now had someone to talk to about cattle for significant portions of the day, which freed her for conversations about other subjects. Mary Gibbs had laughed until her sides hurt, and Clara had smiled with the satisfaction of a woman who knows exactly what she has and is entirely glad about it. The second baby arrived on a warm October morning in 1884, a daughter this time, born easier than James had been and already, in the first days of her life, showing a quality of alert observation that Clara said was entirely her father's and Elias said was entirely her mother's, and Diego, consulted as an impartial observer, said was clearly both. They named her Lucy Ann Calloway, and from the very first day she opened her eyes with the particular focus of a person who intends to understand everything around her. And James, who had reached the walking and opinionated age of 14 months, regarded his new sister with a serious and proprietary attention that would, over the coming years, develop into the kind of fierce and reliable sibling loyalty that is one of the finest things a family can produce. The winter of 1884 into 1885 settled over the broken spur with its usual authority, the cold coming down off the mountains, and the snow dusting the ridge and the livestock tucked close to the barn, and the house warm with fires, and the particular inhabited warmth of a family that has found its form and filled it. On a January evening, with James asleep in his small bed, and Lucy in her cradle and Tom reading in the front room and Diego and Rosa settled in the bunkhouse and Willie and Coy in their own quarters, Elias and Clara sat together by the kitchen fire, which they often did after the children were settled, the private end of the day that belonged specifically to them. She was mending one of James's shirts, a task that required very little of her attention and which left her free to talk, and he was going over the winter feed accounts which required marginally more of his but not enough to prevent a conversation. "I was thinking," Clara said. "About what?" he said. "About the first letter you wrote me," she said. "You said the ranch life was hard but honest. Do you remember?" "I remember," he said. "You were right," she said. "About both parts. It is hard." She looked up at him. "Do you know what you forgot to mention?" "What?" he said. "That it is also beautiful," she said, "and warm and full." She set down the mending and looked at him with those steady dark eyes that had been looking at him steadily for going on 3 years now and had not yet looked away. "You forgot to mention that it would be full." He set down the account book and looked back at her. The fire crackled. The house settled around them in its familiar way, the sounds of cold outside and warmth inside, the sounds of children sleeping and ranch hands settled and horses in the barn and cattle in the pasture and apple trees resting in the dark. "I didn't know it then," he said honestly. "I didn't know it would be full." "No," she said, and she smiled, and it was the smile he had been watching become more fully itself for 3 years, confident and warm and specific to this life, their life. "Neither did I." He reached across and took her hand, and she let him take it, and they sat in the warm kitchen of the Broken Spur Ranch while the January wind pushed against the stones of the walls and could not get in, and Elias Calloway, who had once been a man afraid of his own quiet and the distance between himself and anything warm and real, held his wife's hand in the firelight and understood, with the deep and unshakable certainty of something that has put down roots in good soil, that he had been wrong about himself. He had been wrong in the way that people are sometimes wrong about the most important things, not from dishonesty, but from the limited view that comes from standing too close to your own life. Clara had stood at a different angle and seen something truer, and she had said so in this room, in that clear and steady voice, on a September evening that felt both very long ago and entirely present, and he had been changed by it in ways he was still discovering. He was enough. He had always been enough. He simply had not had anyone stay long enough to prove it to him until a mail-order bride from St. Louis had stepped off a stagecoach in Reedrock crossing on a bright May afternoon and looked at the enormous sky with those dark eyes and hoped not to get entirely used to it. He had not asked her to stay. She had chosen it, every day, the way she had said she would, and she had been right about herself as she was right about most things. Outside the broken spur, the territory stretched in every direction under its magnificent winter stars, vast and cold, and gloriously indifferent to the small lights of human habitation scattered across its surface. And inside the house those lights burned warm and certain, and the family, made by letters and courage and the plain, honest willingness to choose each other, slept and rested and grew, and the apple trees along the south wall of the barn waited for spring, and it was coming, as it always did, as it always would. James Calloway would learn to ride a horse before his 3rd birthday, sitting in front of his father in the saddle with his small, serious face tipped up to watch the clouds. Lucy Calloway would inherit her mother's gift for direct and disarming conversation, and would deploy it with devastating effectiveness throughout her childhood on every adult in a 5-mile radius. Tom Calloway would marry, eventually, a woman from Las Vegas, New Mexico, named Henrietta, who was a school teacher and who thought the Calloway brothers' economy with words was hilarious rather than daunting, which was probably what qualified her for the situation. Diego and Rosa would remain at the broken spur for the rest of their working lives, and their presence was woven so thoroughly into the fabric of the ranch that it was impossible to imagine one without the other. Clara's apple trees bore their first fruit in the autumn of 1886, small and tart, and not yet what they would become with another few years of growth, but real, genuinely and unmistakably real, the first apple harvest of the Broken Spur Ranch, picked on a warm October morning by Clara and James together, James reaching determinedly for every apple he could not quite reach, Clara lifting him for the higher ones while he crowed with victory. Elias watched them from the fence post where he had stopped to rest for a moment during the morning's work, and he felt the fullness she had named, felt it precisely as she had described it, felt it in his chest and his hands and his throat, and he did not look away from it because he had learned finally not to. Clara looked up and saw him watching and held up one of the small red apples. "First harvest," she called. "I see it," he called back. "Come and take one," she called. He climbed off the fence post and crossed the yard and took the apple she held out to him and bit into it, and it was tart and crisp and absolutely perfect, and she was watching him with a smile that had everything in it, this life and this land and this man she had chosen and kept on choosing, and he looked at her over the apple with everything he felt completely visible on his face, which was how it had been for years now and which he no longer tried to conceal. "Good," she said. "Good," he said. "It's very good, Clara." She knew he did not entirely mean the apple, and she smiled the smile that was for him alone, and the October morning went golden and enormous around them, and the Broken Spur held them in its acres and its stones, and the red ridge above caught the morning light, and the sky went on forever above them all, enormous and clear and full of the particular kind of light that makes the world look like it was made to be lived in, which it was, which it absolutely was.